Mr. President,
Senator from Wisconsin.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I also ask for unanimous consent to speak for not more than 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I came to the floor this afternoon before the debate on President Obama's just submitted budget descends into the arguments over the smaller little details that, quite frankly, are not going to really have that great an effect on our whole debt and deficit issue. What I'd like to do is I'd like to take a look and ask the American people to take a look at the larger picture here. And I'd like to do it with a few charts and graphs. The first chart I'd like to put up with really describes, from my standpoint, what the root cause of the problem is. I mean, it really is the size, the scope, all the rules, all the regulations, all the government intrusion into our lives, and the cost of government. And what this graph depicts is, as of last year, the federal government was 24% of the size of our economy. 24 cents of every dollar that our economy generates flows through the federal government. When you add on state and local governments, which are about 16%, the total take of government at all levels in the United States now, last year, was 39.2%. Again, 39 cents of every dollar flows through some form of government. And Mr. President, I don't know about you, but I don't find government particularly effective or efficient at so many things that they do. And to make that relative, we're watching what is happening to Greece right now. It's in flames because that social experiment is collapsing. But if you compare the United States in terms of its size of government to European-style socialist nations, you can see that Norway spends 40% of its GDP on government. Greece, we just mentioned Greece, 47%. Italy, who hit a mini debt crisis of their own, 49%. And France is 53%. Mr. President, unfortunately, America has arrived at the lower limit, the lower level of European-style socialism, and that is not a good metric. The next chart that I want to describe, so many people, I understand, want a balanced approach, revenue and spending reform to address the debt and deficit issue. Listen, I want more revenue too, but I think we need to raise revenue the old-fashioned way by growing our economy. Everything we do in this country, everything we do here in Washington needs to be targeted toward economic growth. But I think what this chart describes is the fact that we have a spending problem. It's not that we tax Americans too little, it's because we spend way too much. 10 years ago, our federal government spent $1.9 trillion. Last year, we spent $3.6 trillion. We doubled spending in just 10 years. And of course, the president's budget that he just unveiled today will spend $3.8 trillion in 2013. And the argument moving forward, nobody's talking about cutting spending. All we're talking about is reducing the rate of growth in spending. You can tell by the chart. According to President Obama's budget, 10 years in the future, in the year 2022, he's proposing spending $5.8 trillion. Last year's House budget would have spent $4.7 trillion. That's what the argument's about. Spending $3.6 trillion last year and increasing it to either $5.8 trillion or $4.7 trillion. Another way of looking at that is taking a look at 10-year spending numbers. In the 90s, a very successful decade, the federal government spent $16 trillion over a 10-year period, $16 trillion. Over the last 10 years, we spent $28 trillion. And again, the debate moving forward is President Obama, in his just released budget, wants to spend $47 trillion over the next 10 years. The House budget from last year would have spent $40 trillion. By the way, when you hear about that $6 or $7 trillion worth of draconian cuts, that's what we're talking about. All we're talking about is reducing the rate of growth in spending in the size of government. Now, you've seen an awful lot of charts describing the nation's debt and how it has exploded. I like this chart because we started on September 30th, 1987, when our entire federal debt stood at $2.3 trillion. And Mr. President, it took us 200 years to incur $2.3 trillion worth of debt. Last year in the Budget Control Act, we gave the president authority, basically. I didn't, I voted against it, but this body gave the president authority to increase the debt ceiling by $2.1 trillion. We'll blow through that debt limit in around 2 years. I mean, think of that. So you can see what's happening. 2001, we were at $5.8 trillion. 2008, right before President Obama entered office, we were at $10 trillion. Currently, we're about $15.3 trillion in the president's just released budget. He's proposing adding $10.6 trillion to our debt over the next 10 years to come in at a whopping $25.9 trillion. The question really is, will we really be able to borrow that much? Or are we going to face the day I fear, the day of reckoning, when world investors take a look at the United States and say, you know, I'm not going to loan you any more money. Or what's more likely to happen is they'll say, oh, I'll loan you some money, but at dramatically higher interest rates. That's what we need to be concerned about. That's what a debt crisis is going to be. Take a look at Greece. Take a look at Italy. One more chart I want to put up here is showing the extent of the problem of the unfunded liability together with the debt. Now, this is actually last year's chart. We haven't been able to get the new one printed yet. But last year, the trustees of both Medicare and Social Security published the unfunded liability of those two programs. When you add those unfunded liabilities to the federal debt and what we owe federal retirees, the total liability of the United States, as reported last year, was $99 trillion. The new figure for this year, the accountants in the federal government have rejiggered the figures. Now they're claiming it's only $72 trillion, but whichever figure you take, if you compare that to the private net assets of the United States, that's household assets, small business assets, large business assets, that number is $79 trillion. So the federal government has made promises, incurred debt that are equal to or exceed the entire net private asset base of the United States. Now, that's a definition of a problem. That's a definition of a huge problem that, unfortunately, this president and this town is not grappling with. We are not coming to terms with that. Let me just specifically hone in on one of those entitlement programs, Social Security. In 2010, we went net cash negative in Social Security, which means the amount of taxes collected were $51 billion less than the benefits that were paid out. Last year, we were $46 billion in the red. If you take a look at this chart, what we see, without reforming the program, without providing the reforms that would actually save Social Security, within the next 24 years, by the year 2035, we will incur a $6 trillion cash deficit in Social Security. And again, when you take a look at the president's budget this year, is that even being addressed? The House budget addressed Medicare last year. And people like my congressman from Wisconsin were demonized for doing it. Here you had an individual that had the courage to, first of all, acknowledge the problem and put forward a proposal, and he's demonized. Political demagoguery is not going to solve our problem. A serious budget is what we need to solve the problem. Now, because we're not serious about even putting forward a budget, and unfortunately in this body, the majority leader is saying he won't even bring a budget to the floor for a vote. There's no need to. We're only going to incur $10.6 trillion more debt in the next 10 years. I want the American people to think about that. I've been involved in business for 33 years. I'm an accountant. This is the first time I've been involved with a financial entity, and let's face it, America is the largest financial entity in the world, where I've been working with that entity that doesn't have a budget. That's a national scandal. We need to correct that. But let me talk about some of the deficit risks. Because we're not serious, we're not even addressing, much less we're not acknowledging. It starts with what I started talking about earlier in terms of not dealing with the debt and deficit issue dramatically increases our risk of higher interest rates, higher interest expense. The CBO reports that for every 1% increase in the interest expense, let's face it, times $15 trillion, times 10 years, that would add $1.5 trillion to our debt. $1.5 trillion. Greece, when they hit their debt crisis, their interest rate spiked by 8%. If that happened here, it would cost us $1.2 trillion. It would wipe out all discretionary spending. That's the day of reckoning we need to avoid by putting forward serious proposals. Another risk that we're really not talking about is what happens if we don't grow according to the projections that the president lays out in his budget or the CBO projects. Well, again, you look to the CBO. For every 1% that we miss our growth targets by, add $3.1 trillion to our debt and deficit over the next 10 years. $3.1 trillion. Another risk is the true cost of the health care law. 38 Republican senators sent a letter to CBO Director Elmendorf pleading with him to please reassess the very unrealistic estimate the CBO made in terms of the number of employees that will lose their employer-sponsored care. Their estimate says only 1 million. But we have studies that have conducted that say 30 to 50% of employers will drop coverage. When that happens, when employees lose their employer-sponsored care and get dumped in the exchanges at highly subsidized rates, the cost of Obamacare won't be $95 billion a year. It's more likely to be over $500 billion to $1 trillion a year. Multiply that over 10 years, and you can see the deficit risk inherent in the health care law. It needs to be repealed. And I guess the last point I'd like to make is a key part of President Obama's supposed deficit reduction in his budget is a tax on millionaires, which, by the way, are defined by people making over $250,000. That's interesting math right there. 2 points. I said earlier, we should not enact anything in Washington that would harm economic growth. Increasing taxes will harm economic growth. That's what the CBO says. That's what Federal Reserve Chairman Bernanke says. And it just makes common sense. I just want any American that actually would think that that's a good idea to ask themselves one question. How many jobs will that tax increase create? How will that tax increase actually help us grow our economy? And the answer is it won't. There's an interesting study that was just released on Maryland's millionaires tax that they enacted in 2007. When they passed that tax, they estimated it would raise $330 million. Well, the facts are in. That tax increase only generated $120 million, only 36% of what they originally estimated. So President Obama's hoping to raise, I guess, $1.5 trillion with the millionaire's tax. Maybe it's only $1 trillion. I haven't seen the details. Take that number, multiply it times 36%, then take a look at the harm it's going to cause to economic growth and reduce it even further. It simply won't work. It might feel good, but it'll do great harm to our economy. So to sum it all up, Mr. President, what this country needs is we need real leadership. We need the president to lead. We need a serious budget. And we need the United States Senate to pass a complete and a serious budget for 2013. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.